I've just won a near impossible case with over 900 days of absence for a naturalization application. And I've also been getting great results for ILR applications as well, where there's been very long absences, usually in connection with COVID one way or another. Now, about a couple of years ago, or even as soon as a year ago, it was easier to get it through. And the government's been tightening and tightening the restrictions. Now, there's a bit of an element of hypocrisy in here because, of course, the UK government famously itself flouted its own COVID guidelines with the COVID parties in 10 Downing Street and that sort of thing. So there's a bit of a tint of hypocrisy when they're pushing back on these applications where people are saying, look, I was complying with the COVID guidelines at the time, and that's why I didn't come back to the UK, because I was abiding by my ethical responsibilities. I didn't want to infect anyone else. And, at some stages, just complying with the law in whichever country. Now, I have some of my applications have included applications from India and also from China. Now, in India, there was the Omicron wave. And of course, we like to forget about COVID now because that era was so traumatic and difficult for so many people. But it's important to reconstruct the chronology. So after, COVID was in the past in the UK, it was still very much relevant, right into 22 and beyond in India and China and many other countries. So the approach that I've been taking is first, and which I recommend to you if you're making an application and you do have excessive absences and you're asking for either absences to be discounted under an ILR application or for discretion to be exercised in the context of a naturalization application, then start with a reconstruction of the COVID chronology, and don't just rely on the internet and AI for this. What I do is go into the actual government archive. So you can go and you can use the Wayback Machine, which is a fantastic resource. And you can take snapshots from the government's from your government's website as it was back in 2020, 21, 22 at the relevant parts while you're away, and see what was the guidance in place at the time. Now, where it tends to get a bit murky is where guidelines were restricted, but there was still, guidelines were less restricted. So there was no legal prohibition on you flying, but it was still basically a bad idea to fly. And that's where you'll want to find something on which you can, to which you can, attach some authority and support, basically to support your view that, look, at the time, if this was the case, you just felt it was not responsible to fly, or you didn't want to expose your family unnecessarily, or other travelers. So have a look at that, definitely. Now, in terms of what the Home Office has been asking for more recently, they have been asking for evidence of cancelled tickets. So basically, you travel overseas, and the assumption is you travel overseas, you have a return ticket, and they want to see, well, when were you intending to return? They'd see that as evidence of when you wanted to come back, because there's an expectation that you should come back at the soonest opportunity. Now, it may be that you just did a one-way flight. I mean, so many people had to fly out, with family emergencies. If, God forbid, your family had COVID and you had to fly out suddenly to support them, then it might just be a one-way flight. But there might be some other evidence of your intention to return sooner, but where you were not able to return sooner, but there's some evidence of you wanting to return. Maybe you were emailing business contacts or friends in the UK saying, look, I'm going to be back on this date, and then it wasn't possible for whatever reason. So if you're fortunate enough to have evidence of you attempting to book or actually booking flights and then they're not going ahead or them being postponed, then that's important. Now, the other thing I'd bear in mind is that even if it was technically possible to travel, but you didn't travel, maybe it was because the flights weren't available because, of course, there was a pent-up demand and in many instances, and then suddenly flight was allowed, but it wasn't possible to book a flight because if they were just being booked out. Or you may have been in one of the bubbles, the so-called air bubbles that existed, like between, say, India and UK, for example, where there was some travel, but say with British Airways, it was only like 5 from Delhi to London. It was only like 5 flights a week, I think, through British Airways. So bear in mind these kinds of considerations. And a really important point is with medical evidence. Now, it might be that it wasn't necessarily the case that just you were unable to travel because of COVID. Let's say if you were ill, in many cases people got COVID and they were unwell. With many of my clients, they've been looking after elderly parents who either did suffer from COVID or were at a risk of suffering from COVID, and they were staying inside, and they wanted you to go and get food, go down to the supermarket to minimize their exposure, or you wanted that for them, and you were insisting on that to minimize the effect on them. Now, if you're in that kind of situation, you really want medical evidence. You want the family doctor to be saying, if it was the case, that had they been exposed to COVID, they would have had a greater risk of severe symptoms and potentially even life-threatening. Maybe they had an underlying health condition. So where you're making these kinds of assertions, make sure that they're fully backed up by medical evidence. Now, the expectation, as I say, a year or 2 years ago, was much lower evidentially than it is now. So you will want the doctor's letter combined with a declaration by you, plus a full chronology of events. And where people sometimes get caught out is where they've been out for a long period, then the restrictions have relaxed and then they haven't come back, but there's no explanation of why they didn't come back sooner. So where people have come to me for the first time with a refusal, where I hadn't assisted them before, they're coming to me for help with an appeal or admin review, then I see the reasons for a refusal, and the caseworkers are saying things like that. In other words, look, we accept that it wasn't possible to come back at this point, but then why didn't you come back sooner when restrictions relaxed at this other point? And that's where there's arguments to be had about, well, maybe it wasn't against the law, but the guidelines at the time or the general climate dictated that it was not reasonable for me to come back given my personal circumstances. So yeah, so as I say, I'm particularly pleased with this most recent result because it was more than 900 days over the 5-year period in a naturalization case. And those kind of cases, it gets escalated to a senior caseworker. So I'm pleased that one went through. And if you're looking for support with an application, whether it's for ILR or citizenship in connection with absences, I'd be very pleased to help you. I have a consultation service. You can get me on the link below. Bye for now.